Another video for the all 15 people of you who actually view my channel. I've been looking today at this sort of commentary on the LinkedIn page, basically about the idea that if you make peace with Russia, that those dirty Russians will come through and carve it up, because you look what happened in World War II with Stalin and Hitler. So, immediately there's a propaganda point right there, because they're completely different regimes to begin with. But that's how it works. It gets people on the emotional content, intellectualism moves to the back. What's disturbing is that so many people who are saying this are people that are actually meant to be senior academics, and they go and waffle on about all the atrocities that were carried out by World War II. Now, and all of them are very, very convincing arguments. But the point that's missing is that gap from 1990 to 2014. This is what you will find when people are talking about this and justifying all the terrible things that Putin has done. And let's get this completely correct. The guy is not a saint. However, in that 20-year period, what we have is early 1990s, the Americans agreeing to perestroika, which in turn fueled Russian glasnost, and the promise being made by the Secretary of Defense, James Baker III, that basically NATO would not move 1 inch eastward. Now, in 93, the first step came about, and this is the same time what's happening is we've just had Rogernomics in New Zealand, and we're watching basically the buyer of all of our public assets by this sort of big corporate neo-world that's using this whole neoliberalism, and that's basically, they're coming across as being very left-wing, while their policies are actually quite economic. And we would actually use those methods, would be actually literally scooped up out of New Zealand and be used by basically speculators to kind of reach into the former USSR and buy it up cheap, giving all these people had shares after the end of the Soviet war, and they buy them up because they had no food, because the economy had been largely deliberately sabotaged. And that's an interesting, it wasn't sabotaged by the Russians, we'll just put it that way, but they had no choice, and so they were selling these shares because they needed food, and they were buying factories and raw resources for a tenth of the price. We're going a little bit ahead of ourselves, so let's go back a little bit. So first of all, we got 1993, and this is the Bosnian crisis. And basically, because of the impasse created by the United Nations, which again was largely engineered by Western components, we started to see the deployment of NATO into Bosnia. So we start to get a move of NATO going 1 inch eastwards. Now, at the same time, what they were doing in Bosnia was the NATO forces were actually arming the far right, which is we'd also see take place, actually happen in the Ukraine. And again, these neoliberal governments, because again, what we see now is moving towards 93 would have been Bush. So that's beginning of the pre-neoliberalism, but that would be carried on by basically Clinton and Obama later on. But they sort of turned around and started to kind of like, also while they were kind of arming these right-wing groups, they started to actually kind of get in the game of business of basically arming rogue states and dangerous actors with basically the components that would theoretically could make weapons of mass destructions, later used as a pretext for the first Gulf War, yada, yada, yada. But this was also used as a pretext for the countries in Eastern Europe that have now been invited to the European Union, which is the first step, the economic bringing them over to, we've got better lifestyles, it'd be better for you, come over this way, we've got some Swedish for you little kiddies. Then they started to get the next mission group was further countries being introduced to NATO, but also being introduced with weapons deployed to those countries because of this political of these rogue nation states, which had largely been armed by the West. So they created the problem, and then they came up with a solution for it, even though it breached the Perestroika Accords. Now, by around about 93, they had the White House Revolution. This is a very pivotal point, because in the White House Revolution, basically Gorbachev sort of ringing up the West and saying, look, we've got all these people complaining about, bread lines and wanting things to go back the old way. And, if we don't, then that's it. We'll be back to the bad old days. We need your help. And the West is saying, well, we'll only do it if you agree to get rid of all forms of social reform and to completely open your country up to the free market. And that basically means that you've got to step down, and we're going to let Yeltsin, the drunkard, take place, and he'll let all these cowboys come in and just buy whatever they want, and no regulation, no checking what's going on. And from that process, basically the door was open for Putin, who at that time was working very well with these Western groups, because he was kind of easing the path away from them, and they thought that he's wonderful, and he's accumulating all these very wealthy people around him because they were getting dividends. So you had this, Putin was he was taking advantage of the opportunity. Why? Whether that was deliberately he had a plan then, or things changed, I don't know. That'll be something that historians will have to write. But He let all these guys in, and all the West thought that he was wonderful, and he's turning up at APEC in New Zealand in 1999, and all these, academics that are currently howling at the top of, oh, evil Putin, he won't let Pussy Riot play. They weren't saying jack shit. There was very, very, very little dissent against Putin. And that really didn't kick until about 2008 when you had the Wachovia case, which is when a Russian Antonov leased to New Zealand company found out all these billions and billions of dollars of arms money were being sucked out of Russia and via the Russian mafia, and basically ending up in the West. And again, this wasn't Putin's design. That was being done by these banks that had he had to let them. Russia had to agree to let these banks be let in, and they were just basically big laundering pits for the wholesale sale and rip-off of Russia. And the key thing here is these banks did not end back in Moscow, in Putin's backyard. They ended in New York. They were designed to make Russia poor. So in 2008, what changed was when that kind of all came out publicly, Putin kind of went on a rampage, and he went around to all these guys that had come in and bought up things cheap and were working with things like the Russian mafia, and basically said, well, open up your textbooks. And then, lo and behold, these guys weren't paying the taxes. So then he started nationalising them. And that became things when people started those same people that had been quite happy with Putin, when he had been letting them, basically let the corporations just come and rip him off. Then they started to he's not very nice to gays, is he? And he won't let Pussy Riot. So then that became his identity politics, not necessarily about what he was doing for the people of Russia or what the West were doing in terms of the abuse, in terms of corporate abuse, or the fact that they were breaching these terms that were designed to bring peace and stability to the world. So that, and at the same time, you've got the various coloured revolutions that were taking place in Eastern Europe that were sucking them into the European Union sphere of influence, which were largely backed by US intelligence. And this would accumulate in 2014 while there were issues going on in terms of the people within the Donbass region that were going, well, we're not being very, very treated very kindly by the Russian, by the Ukrainian government. And that was going on. But then they have elections, and basically the Russian kind of guy that's the Russians support the most, he wins that 2014 election, which is checked and verified by international referees on the matter. And then we basically have a coup d'etat as a result of, a number of Maiden being one incident, which we have the US Embassy ambassador on the phone basically admitting that, yes, this is a CI-backed coup. That 2014, all the way back to 1990, none of these very clever academics to want to talk about that, because suddenly makes you realise that Russia kind of had a reason to kind of take the position they had. Whether they or not, they actually, taken advantage of the situation. Now that's where it gets interesting, because basically we follow the dominoes, and we talked about the dominoes theories in the 1970s. Now that's what the Americans were afraid of. But if we follow what happens, if in America they go to civil war, basically America's not going to be able to help bail out Europe. And Europe has spent years expecting on the Americans, we'll give up, we'll let corporate dominance occur, but you basically protect us, as being the mantra of Europe. Now suddenly if America goes into a civil war environment, where basically it's more tied up with domestic security than it can in terms of being the policeman of the world, then what's going to happen is that effectively Europe is going to be very, very bloody weak. And so whether or not Putin just stops where he is or goes a bit further, I don't know. I'm hoping he stops where he is, but at the end of the day, for 3 or 4 years, they've goaded this guy, they pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed, and then they're going to be surprised if he decides to go, well, no. Hopefully he doesn't. And the reason he doesn't will be that dominoes theory, because if he does, that'll use up more and more resources, which will then make Russia quite vulnerable to China. And I've always maintained that, Russia and Europe and the United States and the West, the whole Western world, had more at stake to making sure that there was a strong, stable, democratically neutral and independent Russia than we are, because we don't. Basically, what we're dealing with is China next, and at the moment, economically, they're about 50 years ahead of everything, scientifically, academically. They've just got us, and while we fight these wars, we're just bleeding out to their advantage. And unfortunately, when you turn around and you start climbing up the corporate ladder of these big guys that are all, funding all these academics to take this position that evil, evil, evil Russia, you start to find out that actually a lot of those corporations have some very interesting relationships with China. And, as I said, we'll see what happens there. But at the current point in time, these people that are trying to make out like, sorry, they've got the moral high ground in terms of Russia. That's just a fabrication. That's not what happened over the last 20 years. The West preyed upon Russia to the point that Russia had enough and said no, and they kept on trying, and then Russia turned around and responded. And that's the worst kind about this, is this middle class level of self entitlement where we can sit back and we can watch the whole West, the West USA, invade nearly 56 countries since the end of World War II, and we're all okay. We might go, oh, there, that's terrible, but we don't actually do anything about it. When the West is okay, running around being basically acting imperialistic, we're okay with it. And so our so-called socialists in the universities, again, we've got so-called socialists taking place. Now the Chancellor of Dunedin University is Grant Robertson, and instead of having socialists say, well, you know what, we should really just say no to spending more money on war, we've still got a Labour Party that's basically joined at the hip with National when it comes to saying, yeah, let's spend lots more money on getting involved in money in wars in the Northern Hemisphere. They're going to bankrupt our own people and make it so that we can't build a hospital in Dunedin, that we can't actually deal with 85,000 people that can't get medical care. That we can continue to have widening gap between rich and poor and only middle class, self-entitled. Well, in fact, there's not many of those around because the middle class are getting wiped out, and it's only just starting to dawn on them that they're the victim of their own cannibalism. But yeah, we need to kind of get back to a point where we actually have a university intellectualism, which is basically about going, no, we're not just joined at the hip with whatever the great ideas of the Northern Hemisphere are, because they're very, really ever very any good for the global South.